Just want to remind you guys, this episode is presented by PrizePicks. Download the app today. Use the code JUICE to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Okay, we are back. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of Bring the Juice. I want to welcome on a special guest, good friend of the show, our friend Andrew Thomason. Andrew, welcome back to the show, man. How have you been? Long time no talk.
Yeah, man, I'm great. Finishing up grad school in the next few months, so that of course keeps me busy. I got married last November, so life changes, priority changes, of course, and I'm doing well. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And how are you doing?
I'm doing well, man. It's kind of that weird time of the year where now it's getting a little bit warm, but I feel like some sickness has been in the air, so still on the mend here, but overall doing well. And this is a great week for the Indianapolis Colts and Colts fans because, Andrew, this is something that we haven't seen really ever under Chris Ballard. The addition of multiple guys, multiple swings in the first few days of legal tampering and up to free agency. I think the Colts have, 6, 7 guys they've already signed, and we're not even a week into free agency. So a total 180 shift from what Chris Ballard did even last year in terms of, adding some new guys outside the building and really making a concerted effort to identify some players that they wanted to bring in. It's been great to see, and it's definitely been a breath of fresh air, I think, for a lot of people to see Chris Ballard and company kind of go outside of their usual MO when it comes to free agency. So what have been your thoughts just on the Colts' approach this year as opposed to years past?
Yeah, I mean like you said, it's a 180. I mean, it really is, Cody. I mean, this is a regime that has been reluctant to spend, especially in that first wave of free agency. And that's not to say that Ballard hasn't found quality players in the later rounds or later waves, if you will, of free agency. He certainly has. Xavier Rhodes, Danico Autry are a couple names that come to mind. But outside of what we've seen in the last week or so, this is brand new territory for Ballard and company, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. These are two guys, and we'll get into a little bit more with Charvarius Ward and Cam Bynum, who the Colts really wanted, and for big reasons. I mean, you move on from Gus Bradley, you bring in Lou Anarumo, you bring in Chris Hewitt, and you bring in, I believe, James Henderson is the other secondary positional coach who they brought in. I apologize if I've butchered that name or if it's incorrect. But my point being is the coaches they've brought in this offseason all have backgrounds in secondary. And so I think that's what they were going to go after. I mean, it makes sense, right, with those guys coming in. And I think really what it boils down to, if you're a Colts fan, Cody, is Chris Ballard was a man of his word. He said in January the secondary wasn't good enough. I've got to be better at identifying players. I've got to be better at closing the deal. Think of Danielle Hunter last offseason, where the Colts were, as reported by so many, heavily involved in the Danielle Hunter market. And then Houston comes in at the last second, understandably because Hunter has ties to that area, and takes him right out from under Chris Ballard and company's nose. And so, this is a completely different approach. The way they've structured the contracts is completely different. And I know you and Derek and others have probably hit on this, but it's an intriguing point. They've backloaded these deals and to create more cap space this offseason and maybe even next offseason. And that's just not something we've seen with Ballard in his 9 years here in Indianapolis. And so when you consider the moves that have been made by this regime, I think it's kind of like you said, Cody. If you're a Colts fan, a breath of fresh air. These are guys that are proven. These are guys that have been Pro Bowlers and All Pros, and in Charvarius Ward's case, been to Super Bowls, and Cam Bynum been to playoff games and have won playoff games. Certainly, obviously, for both of them, and that's something that I think the rest of this Colts roster can really learn from, especially defensively. And I think it's again, if you're a Colts fan, a welcomed approach.
Yeah, no doubt in my mind. I mean, just the automatic upgrade you've already done to completely reshape your secondary with these two guys, it's massive. And I think, Andrew, another thing that just the moves the Colts made. Obviously, the two secondary moves, the move to go get Daniel Jones, even the move to get a backup running back. I think for some people that changes a little bit of where they kind of viewed the needs heading into the draft. And I think it gives you some flexibility there on what you want to do. Right, you're not pigeonholed into a couple different positions that you have to get and you have to upgrade at. Now you've given yourself a little bit more of an opportunity to address it however you want to a little bit better. So when we kind of hop into, moving forward into the draft here in April, obviously now the secondary, while I don't think it needs to be completely untouched in the draft. I mean, really, when it comes to major investments, you did that in free agency. So I think that pushes that way down in the list of all the needs. And there are some other needs that I think have now approached because in doing so, in signing these two players, you did allow a couple really important free agents that were pretty good for you the last number of years out the building, specifically Will Fries at guard and Dio Adengbo at defensive end. So now you look, Andrew, into the draft, and this is something we talked off air. You mentioned Danielle Hunter, the way the Colts pursued him last year, and obviously weren't able to close the deal on him. I know you drafted Leatu Latu last year, but then I look at this and I look at the defensive ends on the roster, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think pretty much everybody outside of Latu is not under contract after 2025. So there's a lot of question marks around that position group. Looking forward into 2026, into the future of that position, there's not a ton of guys that will be under contract at that point. So when you look at defensive end with the way the Colts have addressed it in the draft last year, obviously in round one, their pursuit of Danielle Hunter a year ago, what are your thoughts there on that position? With the loss of Dio Dangbo in free agency, there's a lot of question marks at defensive end, at edge specifically. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you think maybe this is a need for Indianapolis here heading into April?
Yeah, no question. I think it's a very underrated need for the Colts, and you kind of mentioned it. The players on the roster, Kwity Paye is in a contract year. DeForest Buckner and Grover Stewart are reaching the age of 30, and Samson Ebukam, who's coming off of that torn Achilles, is also going to be 30, and I believe in a contract year. So to be clear, I don't know who the Colts are specifically interested in or anything like that. A lot of teams around this time of year are really quiet when it comes to the draft, especially. But I do think defensive line in general is a kind of a sneaky need, maybe in round one or round two. Walter Nolan out of Ole Miss is a name that comes to mind. You look at Shamar Stewart, who had that exceptional combine with his 40-yard dash and broad jump and all these things. I mean, he was exceptional. Josiah Stewart out of Michigan is another name that's interesting, I think, to a lot of people. And so, yeah, I mean, it's I know that there are Colts fans that you look at the need at tight end and they think of Tyler Warren and they think of Colston Loveland, but there's also names like Elijah Arario. There's names like Harold Fanon Jr. and Colston Loveland out of Michigan, and Mason Taylor, LSU. Like there are certainly options beyond the first round at the tight end position. And that's not to say that the Colts don't go tight end in round one. If the guy is there that they like, perhaps they take him, right? But you can't ignore the needs along the defensive line. And as we were talking about off air, and you know how Chris Ballard is when it comes to the trenches on both sides of the ball. I mean, you think you have enough defensive linemen or offensive linemen, and you're in the wrong mindset because no, you don't. And like I said, when you factor in all of that, the ages of the players that I just mentioned along the defensive line, a handful of them being in contract years, it's a sneaky need, and I think it's one that the Colts could potentially address in early rounds.
And you mentioned the offensive line too. What about that? Because right guard right now is up in the air. I mean, you have Matt Gonsalves on your roster, but Andrew, when I look at this, I say, hey, Braden Smith's on his last year of his deal. You don't know the future of right tackle. So potentially in 2026, you have two question marks there. So what is the move for Indianapolis? Because obviously we saw them, in day two, really go and make a concerted effort to address that in a big way, right? With obviously the drafting of Gonzalez and the drafting of Tanner Bortolini in round 4. So what do you think would be the approach here for the Colts to kind of restack the cupboard a little bit specifically on that right side of their offensive line to, because, obviously we know a guy like Bernard Ryman's going to be looking for a new contract. Quentin Nelson, he's paid what he's paid. Bortolini, you think is going to be your starter there. He's on his rookie deal. But then that right side, after 2025 and into next year, there's going to be a lot of question marks on those guys, and we don't know obviously who's going to be on the roster at that point, but specifically right tackle, there's going to be some question marks. More than likely, again, we'll see Braden Smith may not be on this roster in 2026. So Colts are going to have to figure that out. So what are your thoughts on how you would like to see them maybe address this offensive line in terms of maybe some depth guys right now and maybe some guys who can compete for that right guard position?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think you look at some of the interior players who they've brought back, Wesley French and Danny Pinter, both on one-year deals, according to multiple reports. Certainly, backup center is never a bad thing to have with Ryan Kelly's departure. Tanner Bortolini is going to slide in, the second-year man out of Wisconsin, to play at the starting center position for Indianapolis. And then you look at right guard. Matt Gonzalez, I think, is something that the Colts would really look into. I mean, they took him in the third round. I think they believe that he has the skill set, the agility, and power to slide at right guard, even if it's just for a year while Braden Smith is back at right tackle. And you could potentially address guard in the second or third round, or maybe even fourth round in the draft. I know there are some free agent names that may be of interest to Colts fans. You look at someone like Tate Ratledge out of Georgia, who could potentially be an option in the later rounds for them, or maybe in the second or third round even. There are certainly options, both in free agency and the draft. If I had to, I guess, take a guess at what the Colts would do, my best guess is they probably go after a swing tackle, possibly in free agency, maybe the draft, and they kick Matt Gonzalez inside to right guard. They leave Braden Smith outside at right tackle for one final season, and then they draft somebody to potentially replace Matt Gonzalez at that right guard spot, and then move Gonzalez back to right tackle in 2026.
As we said, guys, today's episode is sponsored by PrizePicks. Now, what is PrizePicks? PrizePicks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. Instead of battling against thousands of other players across platforms, you're basically picking 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you're choosing more or less on those stat projections to be able to watch those winnings roll in. It's very easy. Do you guys want to play along at some of PrizePicks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and UFC fighter Sugar Sean O'Malley? Well, if you guys sign up today, you can find the community plays under the promos tab of the app to view the entries of some of the biggest names on the platform and be a part of that as well. You can now win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 just like that with NBA, NHL, and college basketball entries today on PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. Like a lot of other things, guys, they also offer injury insurance, so your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. So if someone exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player projection won't count against you and the rest of your entry stays live. So it's great bounce back for that one. What I love about the app as well, guys, is it's not just sports like NBA, NHL, football, and tennis, and baseball, and all these other things, but there's also a lot of others that go into it as well. If you like to place entries on video game situations like Call of Duty, CS2, Apex, if that's something that appeals to you, there's a wide variety of sports and video games and everything else that you can place entries on. And I love how expansive it is. Even just looking at the NBA, there's entries you can make with turnovers, with points. You can do combo deals, dunks, field goals attempted, all of these different things. So there's just so many different ways to make money off of these entries. Be sure to download the app today and use the code JUICE to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup.
It'll be interesting to see how they address that. I'm very curious. One other position I think that's really the big one on defense as well is the linebacker position, Andrew. Obviously, you lost Grant Stewart to free agency. EJ Speed is still a free agent, but seems like he's not coming back at this point. So you do have an opening alongside Zaire Franklin at the linebacker position. And now, when you look at this position, obviously we've seen Andrew, the Indianapolis Colts in the past have some really good success in drafting and finding guys. But obviously, you have a guy like Jihad Campbell there, right there in that first round that a lot of people have said that is the fit for Indianapolis. But there's a lot of linebackers here that I think could make some sense for the Colts. So, how would you like to see them address that position and potentially get a guy in there to compete with Jalen Carlies for that other linebacker position?
Well, you mentioned it. The Colts have been relatively, I shouldn't say relatively, they've been very successful at drafting linebacker in the Chris Ballard era. And so my first, I guess, inkling is to maybe look toward the draft and see what would be available. For the Colts, maybe even in the later rounds. You look at guys like Zaire Franklin and Bobby Okereke, guys that have been taken in the mid to later round, or in Okereke's instance, pardon me, has made big money elsewhere with the Giants. And so I say all of that to get to my main point of there are some options in free agency, no question. I think you would consider them to be lower level options, second, third wave players, right? Doesn't mean that the Colts may not be interested, but there are certainly a lot of players at that weak side linebacker position in the draft that I think would be intriguing fits for the Indianapolis Colts. And so I think you could go both directions, really. It is kind of an underrated need. I don't think EJ Speed is brought back, if I had to guess. And so it'll be interesting to see how Chris Ballard and company approach that position. And it could also be a position where they just insert Jalen Carlies, who is a former safety they took in the later rounds of last year's draft and converted him to linebacker. Being that he's a former safety, he's got that coverage type of ability that I think Lou Anarumo looks for in that particular position. And so I think Carlies is certainly an option that they would consider, along with maybe a draft pick or even a lower level free agent. So it'll be interesting to see what route they go.
Yeah. Are there any other positions, Andrew, that you're looking at that might be kind of like sneaky needs that we're maybe not talking about out of the positions we just mentioned? Are there any other positions you could see the Colts adding for competition, say, in the secondary, in the defense, and the offense in any way, skill positions, anything like that you would say that might be a sneaky need that we're not talking about, but would not be shocked at all if the Colts took a guy at some point in the draft?
Yeah, it's interesting. I know a lot of Colts fans, understandably, have sort of hitched their wagons to Tyler Warren or Colston Loveland or Jihad Campbell or one of these other big name players. Certainly, and those are needs as we've talked about. But one of the interesting things that may not be as big of a need because they just brought in Javarius Ward, who's only 28 years old, and you have Jalen Jones on the outside, is maybe outside corner. There's a I think a very I would consider it to be a plausible scenario where Will Johnson of Michigan potentially falls to 14, and he would be an interesting selection for the Colts there. Now you would potentially have to start wondering if he would sort of supplant Jalen Jones in that second cornerback role or spot rather. What would Jalen Jones's role be moving forward? You have Kenny Moore and Samuel Womack in the slot. What does that mean for Juju Brents? And so there's certainly conversations that would have to be had if Johnson were to be the selection at 14. Outside of that, I think the cornerback depth for Indianapolis is fine, especially with the addition of Ward. And safety, I think, is an interesting, specifically depth at safety. Let me be clear. Cam Bynum is going to be their starting free safety more than likely, and Nick Cross their starting strong safety. And Cross had a fairly solid year for the Colts last year. And so I think they're hoping and banking on him and his upside and his potential that he showed. And so, like I said, you have Cam Bynum and Cross at the free and strong safety positions respectively, and then you certainly need backups for both of them. I mean, I don't think Julian Blackman is back. Rodney Thomas, I think, is still on the Colts roster. They could potentially cut him and save a little bit more money. We'll see what they end up doing. And then as far as the strong safety position goes, I'm not exactly sure who they have behind Nick Cross. I'd have to go and take a look. But that is, I think, a potential sneaky position that they may look to target later in the draft. Or again, maybe they look into free agency and see what some of the second and third wave has to offer in terms of players that may be available. Again, solely for depth purposes.
What about running back? Because we saw what the Colts did a couple days ago. We know when they brought in Khalil Herbert, but you kind of look at that, and I've said this. I don't know what your opinion is. I think you still draft a running back at some point in this draft, especially considering how deep of a class it is. What would be your thoughts on adding another running back into that mix? Because obviously Khalil Herbert has had some pretty good production when he's been on the field, but again, I just think, from what you had last year, you just need to continue to have some bodies in there, some guys that can rotate and help spell Jonathan Taylor. Because again, he's had a lot of carries in his NFL career. He had a lot in college. So I'm kind of just looking at that and saying, is that an option? And, do you maybe try to get more of a receiving option? I know Herbert can do it, but is there maybe another guy you look to get? I know you have Tyler Goodson on your roster, but do you look to potentially upgrade there in any way? Or is there another type of back you're looking at? Is that a position you might see the Indianapolis Colts taking? Obviously not probably super early, but maybe in more the mid rounds, maybe late day 2, early day 3.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible, and I think it's something they should consider. Look, they brought in Khalil Herbert, former Chicago Bear. I believe he was most recently with the Bengals on a one-year deal. And so that to me says that they're very serious about bringing in somebody who can back up Jonathan Taylor. I mean, we know that Taylor had an exceptional year for the Colts, 1,400 plus yards, I believe 10 plus touchdowns total for Taylor last year. And so, he still is their bell cow. But when you consider the need at backup running back, again, I think Herbert partially addresses that, and he can be a good pass catching back, as you mentioned. But I think it's certainly still a need that the Colts can look into. I know I've looked at some mock drafts, and Devin Neal from Kansas, I believe, is a name that's been mocked to the Colts in the later rounds. And there are other potential backs that they could consider in the draft as well. Maybe somebody in free agency, although I think the big move, if you will, in terms of their backup position is that Khalil Herbert 1-year deal. And as you mentioned, they have Tyler Goodson, who I think showed some flashes in a limited role last year. I think he's potentially or could potentially be their third back. I think they really like what he brings. They signed him to a 1-year deal, I believe, prior to the beginning of free agency. And so certainly, I think, certainly they'll have options, whether it's through the final waves of free agency or, like you said, maybe a mid to late round draft pick, similar to Naheem Hines a few years ago, that pass catching back that can come in and help make things, I guess, a little easier for the Colts offense and finding shorter passes to be easier. And when you look at the Colts quarterback situation, and maybe I didn't phrase that the best way, but my point being is that Anthony Richardson is going into a major year 3. I think a lot of people deem it to be a prove it year. And how do you find those kinds of yards and short passes to be easier? You bring in a pass catching back, and you allow Anthony Richardson to be able to find checkdowns in certain cases. And you want to get somebody that's got that pass catching ability and a little bit of speed, if you will, to make things easier for him. And got to have at moments that kind of pass catching back would make life easier for Richardson and company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, man, how they go and address it. Like, there still are a lot of needs. There's obviously some tier 1 needs, and there's some other needs that Colts could use to add some depth in these certain positions. And I mean, Andrew, we've heard Chris Ballard say that the Colts need to seriously add depth and competition in these rooms. So I'll be interested to see how they do. And, I don't know about you, but I think they're still going to add a few guys in free agency to help with some depth too. Just the way you mentioned earlier, the way that they've constructed some of these contracts makes me think they like this flexibility. They like the ability to potentially go and sign a few more guys. Well, yeah, it's probably not going to be a Cam Bynum, Javarius Ward signing. It might be a signing that could help out with some of these needs. And you look at a month from now and you say, okay, there's some different positions now that have sunk in and risen in terms of some of the needs that the Colts might need. But we'll have to see how that works, man. I do appreciate your time, and I'm going to be intrigued to see what happens here in April in the draft, because Colts definitely helped themselves out in free agency so far.
Yeah, no question. You mentioned it earlier, the additions rather of Bynum and Ward, and even if Daniel Jones, don't force that need in the draft. Now you have, I think, more options, especially in the early rounds, rounds 1 to 3, for example. You don't have to go corner, you don't have to go safety, you don't have to go backup quarterback. In those rounds. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that they would, but you don't ever know. But they've done themselves some favors, big time, by bringing in quality players and being active early on in free agency, and we'll see how it pays off for them. So thanks for having me
Awesome.
on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Andrew. Do appreciate your time, and we'll have to do it again soon.
Yeah, no question. Thanks, Cody.